Hello and welcome to the Srijan Wednesday webinars. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies where you can tune into a variety of sessions across the fields of technology, entrepreneurship, and community building. Today we are joined by Preston Development Manager, Acquia Labs. Preston will be talking about Decoupled Drupal and the future of Drupal's API first initiative with the coming iterations in Drupal 8. Before we begin, I would request all participants to please type in any questions that you have during the presentation, and we will take them up in the last 15 minutes of the session. Also, please don't forget to take the conversation live on Twitter using our hashtag SrijanWW. You can share your thoughts by tagging us in your tweets using our handle @Srijan and @Preston. So that should be up on your screens right about now. So let's dive in. Preston, over to you.
Alrighty, thank you so much for that introduction. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today and to talk about Decoupled Drupal and the future, as well as the state today of Drupal's web services. So I know that Nilanjana just gave me a very great introduction about who I am, but just very quickly, I've been a Drupal developer since 2007. I do a lot of speaking about Decoupled Drupal. You might have seen a lot of my sessions at various DrupalCons or other webinars or other conferences about Drupal and how you can use it in an API-first context. So if you want to learn more about Acquia Labs, I'll have more information at the end. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to cover today. So the first thing I want to talk about briefly is Drupal web services at a glance. What are the web services that are available within Drupal? What does the overarching context look like, and how does it all play out when it comes to actually implementing an application? Next, I'll talk about what happened to lead to web services being available and the foundations of web services support in Drupal 8.0, and some of the particular characteristics and nuances that are present in 8.0 as a release. Next, I'll talk about Drupal 8.2 and a lot of the changes that have taken place and a lot of the big fundamental and significant advancements that have happened within developer experience and things like cross-origin resource sharing within Drupal 8.2. Next, in Drupal 8.3, I want to delve just very briefly and touch on some of the advancements that will be coming up in the current beta. And then I'll talk briefly about what's ahead in Drupal 8.4 and 5. One of the things that you may know is that Drupal 8.4 was recently deemed to be a sort of stability release, which means that a lot of the focus will be on bringing those experimental core modules into stability. Finally, I want to talk just a little bit about the overarching web services landscape in the contributed context, namely modules such as JSON API, GraphQL, relaxed web services. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about zooming out and taking a look at the bigger picture. And what does it mean for us to have web services? And what is the future of web services? And how does Drupal fit into all of this kind of context? So without further ado, let's go ahead and move forward here. First off, I want to summarize very briefly why web services are important and why exactly we're so concerned about them, for those of you who might not be as familiar with some of these concepts. So fundamentally, very simply put, web services are responsible for allowing any kind of communication or arbitration of content between Drupal and other systems. So they enable this transfer of data. And most commonly these days, what you see is a transfer of data happening between decoupled front ends, such as isomorphic JavaScript applications or native mobile applications, as well as other backend systems. So this can be other CMSs, such as Ruby on Rails or Python-based systems or any other kinds of applications that you might be building on the back end. So when we refer to decoupled Drupal or API-first Drupal, it's the process of using Drupal as this kind of data service, as a communicator between these applications, such that you can rely on Drupal for this exposure and this emission of data that you can then consume when you build these applications. The most common entry point for these other applications into Drupal is a REST API, which stands for Representational State Transfer. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here. But one thing to note here is that a REST API is not necessarily the only way of accessing Drupal's data via API. So this is a diagram that shows very, very simply what's going on in terms of what most often happens in a web services context. Typically what happens is you have a site or repository that's built in Drupal that has a web services layer on top, and this is where the REST API lives. A request comes in from the decoupled application, and this can be something that is fronted by a software development kit or SDK, or a simple HTTP client. And this HTTP request that is issued by the decoupled application fires off, requests certain data from the web service. In this case, it could be a REST API. And then the web service will respond with an HTTP response in terms of JSON or XML. And in Drupal's case, it can actually return any response that it will issue in JSON or XML. So the Drupal web services that are available today can really be split into three different categories. You have the core REST milieu of modules, and any data that is being exposed through the core REST system can be exposed in terms of structure as the internal storage of Drupal that mirrors directly what is happening in the database, or it can be taking place in a HAL normalization. HAL stands for Hypertext Application Language. And in this case, it's a particular standard that allows you to deal with things like linked data and any sort of data that you might need to request from Drupal. However, one of the things that's very important to realize is that HAL was introduced into Drupal back in 2012 in sort of the very late stages of web services development within Drupal 8's development cycle. And what this means is that there's a large bevy of contributed REST solutions that are available also right now in the ecosystem around Drupal. These include JSON API, Relaxed Web Services, and the Services module, which is the successor of the Drupal 7 Services module. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, there's not just RESTful solutions that are available. You don't necessarily have to use a REST API to communicate with Drupal. There's also non-RESTful web services, and the primary example of this is GraphQL. And I'll talk a little bit more about GraphQL towards the end. Here's a diagram which illustrates for you some of the dependencies and some of the ways in which the modules interact with one another. In Drupal core, there's two types of ways that you can actually expose data. The first is by using the REST module, and which depends on the serialization module. But this actually exposes raw JSON structures that mimic the way that Drupal conducts its data storage. In terms of actually following a more convenient standard, there's also the HAL normalization, which is available in core as part of the HAL module. And this is something that is very important if you want to use that particular standard or if you have particular applications that do rely on that standard. There's a couple of other modules that are very important to consider here. The first, of course, being Relaxed Web Services, which relies on both the RESTful Web Services module in Drupal core as well as the serialization module. Waterwheel also does as well, but I want to put that off to the side a little bit because the Waterwheel module actually has some very particular considerations that make it very particular and very specific to a set of use cases. Then there's also JSON API, which doesn't rely on the RESTful Web Services module within core and relies solely on serialization. And finally, of course, there is the GraphQL module, which lies off on its own in its own little territory. So let's talk a little bit about Drupal 8.0 and what emerged from this particular release. And I want to talk about this because many of you may be building Drupal 8 sites, but you may not be necessarily upgrading to Drupal 8.1 or Drupal 8.2 or even Drupal 8.3 beta because of certain reasons of stability or because you might be really interested in seeing where those minor releases go. Well, one of the most important developments that occurred during the history of Drupal 8's development is that we had the Web Services and Context Core initiative led by Larry Garfield, or Krell, which enabled RESTful web services in Drupal. Now, this initiative had a much larger scope than web services, but for our purposes, the most important objective of this initiative was to enable server-to-server communication. At the time, in the year 2012, 2013, a lot of the use cases that we were seeing around web services were primarily oriented around things like content staging or server-to-server synchronization of content. In recent years, however, because of the JavaScript renaissance, and I've done a lot of speaking on this subject if you're interested in learning more, because of the ways in which application development has evolved and because of the ways in which consumption of APIs have changed, the actual usage of these web services has migrated very significantly over to more server-to-client communication. The default REST API available that's off the shelf in Drupal 8 core is actually fully REST compliant. And for those of you who don't know, REST is a set of ideas, a set of principles for building APIs that was promulgated by Roy Fielding in his PhD dissertation. And the core of it is basically to use HTTP methods, the same underlying methods that are very important to how browsers interact with servers and how we interact with our browsers in general, to actually apply that to the ways in which servers encompass each other from a REST API standpoint. The successor to the WSGI initiative, or Web Services and Context Core initiative, is the API First initiative, which directly addresses this idea of, well, we now have these other use cases that are very important and fundamental to the ways that we develop applications and the ways that we architect an application ecosystem. The API First initiative has a primary objective to expand Drupal's web services capabilities in various ways. And as a result, we're talking not just about these use cases where you're thinking about a fully decoupled use case where you've got a completely headless application, but also things that might be happening within Drupal itself. Meetings, by the way, if you're interested in joining, are held from 6 to 7 p.m. on the third Monday of every month on GMT. Core conversations often take place at DrupalCon. If you tweet at me or if you send me an email after this presentation is over, I'm happy to send you details about the calendar invite and the event itself. So what about Core REST? What's so interesting about Core REST? Well, the Core REST modules allow for all content entities within Drupal. And if you're unfamiliar with what entities are in Drupal, they're the underlying bread and butter of what allows you to create content and manipulate configuration. In terms of content, in Drupal 8, there are two different kinds of entities. There's content entities and there's configuration entities. Content entities encompass anything from nodes, users, taxonomy terms, to comments. And this can be exposed through the REST API that's available in Drupal core through JSON plus HAL, which is the HAL normalization in a JSON format, or as JSON that represents Drupal's internal storage. And there's a very key crucial difference here because you might be looking at very different use cases depending on what you would like to support. In addition, one of the most important advancements that has happened in the Views module for Drupal 8 is that Views natively supports a REST export display type as a new presentation of your data. And what this means is that as you build your REST API, you can either have individual nodes or individual entities being revealed and being retrieved through this content API, or you can retrieve collections through Views. And there's two different systems that operate along those lines. There's many issues that are in existence for REST in core, and they're tagged with RX, which is REST experience. And if you're interested in contributing, you can look on Drupal.org for those issues. Let's talk very briefly about some of the core REST modules just to elucidate some of the issues that are contained in those modules. Serialization is a very important module because it actually is what is responsible for translating Drupal data in terms of its internal storage into JSON serialized data or HAL normalized data. And so what the serialization module does is it provides normalizers and encoders. It normalizes Drupal data into arrays, and then those normalizations can actually be converted, can be sent to an encoder, forwarded to an encoder, which transforms those arrays into formats like JSON or XML. RESTful Web Services lies in front of the serialization module and actually is what allows for that HTTP-based RESTful communication with those resources that are wrapped up and encoded as JSON or XML. Now, these are resources that are not just limited to content entities and views, because you can actually create custom resources through REST plugins. And you can do anything that you might want to do. And there's a lot of implementations that I've seen actually around the wild which use custom resources. And one of the things that you might have noticed is the services module in particular uses this approach quite a bit in Drupal 8. Next, you've also got HAL, which, as I mentioned, is the hypertext application language normalization, which is on top of the serialization module, and actually is what it enables you to design an API that is focused on linking between resources. HAL's primary value proposition is that you can move between these distinct resources that are linked but maybe not embedded with one another through hyperlinks that are contained within each JSON response or XML response if you're using that encoding. Basic Auth is the primary way for you as a decoupled application developer, as a Drupal-backed application developer on a separate domain or on a separate code base from the Drupal site to actually authenticate your requests into Drupal. And so it allows you to include a username and password with request headers and allows you to fetch those resources if you need more permissions than an anonymous user. For security purposes, you should really only use it with HTTPS. And also, of course, which I'll cover very shortly here, there's also issues around cross-origin resource sharing. So very quickly here, if you want to set up RESTful Drupal, and you're interested in doing this very quickly, you can actually do this with a couple of commands here by enabling those REST modules that are available in Drupal core, which are not necessarily enabled by default for performance reasons. There's also the REST UI module, which is very helpful if you want to have a very quick and easy way to configure your REST API in terms of its permissions and in terms of its configuration. One thing to note, however, is that this is an approach that I've only tested in Drupal 8.0. And of course, configuration in REST has evolved, as I'll cover shortly. So a fair warning here that this might only work in Drupal 8.0. Now, for those of you who are familiar with API clients that are great for API testing, there's a client called Postman, which I use very often. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how these requests look, but I'm not going to show you how they look in curl or how they look in JavaScript XHRs or how they look in PHP Guzzle, because that's really beyond the scope of this, and I'd like to focus just on the things that are necessary and just the headers that you need to provide. If you're interested and you want to reach out to me afterwards, I can provide you with further information about how each of those requests work, depending on the language that you're using. But fundamentally here, in Drupal 8.0, when you want to fetch an individual node, or any sort of entity in general, all you have to do is to take the direct path, not the non-aliased path of the resource, of the entity itself, and attach a query string parameter, which is _format equals JSON. And if you fire this against the host, you will get a response back. And as you can see, I've accidentally included the Postman token here because that's what happens on every single request. In terms of creating a new node, one of the things that's very different here is that the path has changed to entity/node. And this is, once again, Drupal 8.0. What you want to do is you want to make sure that your request is authorized, and in order to do that, you need to provide a basic auth header that also includes the token, the hashed password that you want to use. And of course, in the request body, you do want to include a JSON object that contains the particular key value pairs that you want to create into this node. And so what this will create is a node of type article with this title, a filler text, with a value of this body. Now, one thing to note here is that if you wanted to, you could also do this in XML. However, a lot of people are doing this less and less, and obviously, because of JavaScript being a very important language these days, you see XML-based APIs, and APIs in XML really occurring much less frequently in the wild. Of course, patch is the method that you want to use for updating an individual node. And once again, if you have permissions, which I highly recommend you do because you don't necessarily want to allow anonymous users to update all of your entities, you can do that through this kind of request. And of course, there is an included body here for the request, which requires an additional ID for the entity, and of course contains the key value pairs for what you need contained inside. Now, there's one other note that I want to make here, which is that if you have a domain that is separate from your Drupal site, and that is where you are hosting your application that is decoupled, if you're hosting your Ruby application or your Symfony application there, or your JavaScript application there, or your Android application there, chances are you're not going to be able to fire any requests against Drupal because, and this is especially true of JavaScript, because of the same origin policy in browsers. When you open up a browser, you'll see an error message appear whenever you try to fire these requests, because browsers, because the Drupal site does not allow you to fire requests that are browser-based unless they're from the same origin. So cross-origin resource sharing is a way to allow that to be mitigated. And so in this case, for Drupal 8.0, and this is once again I'm making that very clear because Core's support has changed in the last couple of minor versions. The only ways to do this were to either use Apache 2 headers and adjust those within the configuration of your server, or to use the cores module, which is developed by Sally Young of Lullabot. And this is a very convenient module which allows you to configure not only the access, what access these domains have to your database. And as you can see, that's represented here, sorry, not to your database, but to your Drupal site. And as you can see here, that's represented by a wildcard asterisk. As well as any domains following that pipe, which are going to represent the domains that you're going to allow to take advantage of your Drupal site. And so in this case, the localhost domain that I'm using here is actually my test domain for my JavaScript application that I've built to request data from Drupal. Now, of course, with any configuration, just to be better safe than sorry, it's always a good idea to do a cache rebuild. And by the way, rest.cr, if you're more familiar with Drupal 7, is the way to create your caches in Drupal 8. One note that I want to make here, because it doesn't fit very well into any of these other sections, is about the Waterwheel SDK ecosystem. One thing you might remember from that illustration I showed you about 10 minutes ago, showing the relationship between the server and client, and the relationship between the backend application and the client-side application, is that oftentimes an SDK can lie in front of that application on the front end. In our case, what's really tough for JavaScript developers oftentimes is to deal with some of the niceties and the nuances of performing requests against the Drupal API, or also interpreting responses from the same REST API, because of the particularities such as that query string parameter, which requires you to insert that format, or other sorts of problems that might arise when you're a JavaScript developer who doesn't know Drupal and doesn't understand the inner workings of Drupal. So in order to mitigate that, my team at Acquia has begun to release a collection of SDKs, which make it easier for developers to build these Drupal-backed applications in various technologies. The Waterwheel module is actually a module whose aim is to track slightly ahead of core when it comes to some of these really cutting-edge features that a lot of developers want. Namely, resource discovery, which is another way of saying exports of content schemas to the client side. Oftentimes, as your client-side application developer, you want your application to have some understanding of the underlying schema on the server side. And the reason for this is that if you're building any kind of forms or any kind of process of updating entities on the server side of Drupal, or if you're doing any kind of creation of content, you want to have an understanding of what content types are available to you. And so what resource discovery allows you to do is to actually request a content model collection from your Drupal site, get an understanding of what that content schema looks like, and then actually use that for purposes of things like client-side form validation, if you so choose. There's also generated API documentation, which is very, very particular for Drupal and very important for Drupal, because if you want to be able to document your API, Drupal's data model is constantly changing if you're working on a site that's in production or if you're working on a site that's very rapidly moving. Oftentimes, your content types will change on a dime. And as a result of that, your REST API that is fronting your Drupal site also changes and also evolves. And one of the problems is that there's no way to really write documentation that's static that allows you to keep track of your API as it is modified over the course of these content model changes. And so as a result, we also offer, as part of the Waterwheel module, Swagger API documentation based on the Swagger framework, which is essentially a generated documentation framework for REST APIs. If you're interested in learning more about these projects, there's a couple of GitHub links up there. We have 2 available SDKs in JavaScript and in Swift for iOS and any Apple applications that you might be building, as well as the Drupal module on your screen. So with that, I want to turn the page a little bit and talk about Drupal 8.2 and what are some of the things that have happened in recent times. As a quick list of what's been happening, I'll give you a quick rundown of some of the features that have changed in Drupal 8.2. In 8.2, we now have configuration entity read support. We have opt-in core support. We have RPC endpoints for various user interactions that are important to Drupal accounts. We have REST configuration that's been converted to, oops. Uh-oh. 1 second. We've got some technical difficulties here. Not sure why that refreshed. Give me 1 second to bring this back. Thank you for bearing with me here. We have REST configuration that has been converted to configuration entities, and I'll explain a little bit more about that shortly. And also comment updates are possible via REST. I lied a little bit, by the way, and I'm sorry for lying briefly just a few minutes ago when I said that all content entities are able to be read, updated, deleted, and created. That was not actually true of comments until very recently. And also various DX benefits, which I'll go into shortly here. So configuration entities, which are very important in terms of things like block configuration or vocabularies, content types, some of these things that are much more relevant to the inner workings of Drupal. are now things that you can request and retrieve via GET queries. And this is very helpful if you want to have some client-side visibility into, for example, what content types are available or what vocabularies are available, things of that nature that are tied to a particular piece of content. So if you, for example, know that you have a very particular vocabulary that that's being referred to by a taxonomy term, content entity, then you can fetch that vocabulary information alongside the taxonomy term in a separate request. Now, I'm showing you a couple of curl commands here because that's the easiest way to get all of this to fit into one slide. But as you can see the resource endpoints there, which are very clear, as well as, of course, the required query string parameter to get the correct format, which can also be JSON, of course. We also now have opt-in core support in Drupal 8.2. Fully decoupled applications, as I mentioned earlier, if you're relying on a domain, if you're hosted on a domain that's totally separate from the Drupal site, you're not going to be able to issue these sorts of asynchronous requests because you're going to be blocked by the same origin policy. And this is true of JavaScript developers in particular who are building, let's say, these isomorphic, Node.js-driven JavaScript applications. In the past, obviously, this was done through Apache configuration or through the cores module, but now there's actually core support for this. And of course, it's not enabled by default because of the security ramifications of allowing these other domains to have this kind of unfettered access to Drupal. So now if you go to your default.services.yml file, and you'll see this actually there as a copy of what you might want to configure. YAML entry there, which allows you to enable, specify which headers are allowed for these requests coming in, specify which methods you're going to allow these clients of your REST API to access or your web services to access, the allowed origins, so you can limit this to a single domain or a set of domains that you want, exposed headers, max age. Some of these are beyond the scope of this, but I do want to note that there is ample documentation about this when you go into the REST documentation. There's also RPC endpoints available now. RPC, by the way, stands for Remote Procedure Call, for login, status, logout, and reset password. So all of these things you can actually do if you are building an application and you want to be able to log into Drupal or log out of Drupal, if you want to be able to reset a password or check if the user is logged in. That's all things that you can do, as long as you have the right permissions, of course, via these RPC endpoints in 8.2. And this is something that was not possible in 8.1 or 8.0. But as you can see, we have the ability to log in, check a user's login status, and log out. And what's very nice about these requests is that if you don't provide, let's say, a credential that's missing, or if you don't provide any credentials at all in terms of a body, the responses are actually quite intelligent and will say, you're missing a credential, or you're missing some of this information, which is very useful when it comes to error reporting. Now, one of the things I want to note about REST configuration is that prior to 8.2, REST configuration was generally a pretty complicated process and a very unique process, which required you to go into your resources and determine how these methods were going to be handled and list out the formats, list out the authentication methods. And this was not very granular. You were not able to really choose, let's say, to only allow certain things to happen for a particular format or for a particular authentication method. And so what's happened is that the REST configuration in Drupal 8.0 has now been transformed into configuration entities in Drupal 8.2. Now, what's really important to note here is that one of the reasons why this has happened is because configuration entities are much better supported in Drupal 8, thanks to the Configuration Management Initiative and the Configuration Entity System in Drupal. And also because a lot of these things really needed to declare dependencies. For instance, if you at some point remove the node module for whatever reason, because you want to speed up your Drupal site for whatever reason, you might not be able to access the REST API any longer because of the fact that the REST configuration previously was dependent on nodes being present and did not have any access or visibility to that dependency. So REST configuration entities are now much more clear. It does require us to do a little bit more work when it comes to setting up REST configuration. But of course, there are UIs available, and I do have several talks that do discuss how to actually configure your REST API for particular use cases based on this paradigm. There's also a couple of very important developer experience benefits. If you've ever created an entity through the REST API, you might have noticed that you get a nice response code that's something like 201 created or something like that. But you might have noticed that you don't actually really see any sort of response that indicates what the actual updated or created entity looks like. And so now in Drupal 8.2, once you create an entity, it will actually return the created entity in the response. And also the same is true of updates. So what's new in Drupal 8.3? Well, Drupal 8.3 primarily was a focus on user registration and developer experience. The API First initiative chose to actually focus a bit more of this attention on the Drupal 8.3 development cycle on things like JSON API in order to bring that to a place where it could go into core. And so there's a couple of things that have happened. The first is that, of course, we now have user registration now possible alongside those other RPC endpoints that I talked about earlier, as well as a few DX advancements. So REST plugins, certain things have been made easier. You no longer have to provide a serialization class, for instance, and also some changes in module scope. Some elements of the serialization module have been moved to HAL. Some of the sections, some of the portions of the RESTful Web Services module, REST module in core, have been moved to HAL. Obviously, a lot of this is very detailed and is probably beyond the scope of this session. But in case you're very curious about what's changed in Drupal 8.3, the answer is really not that much. Now, as I mentioned before, Drupal 8.4 has been cited as being a time of stability. The core committers have recently decided, I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but the core committers and the framework managers have decided recently to allow for a bit more stability to enter into those core experimental modules that have gone into core in Drupal 8.1, Drupal 8.2. And so a lot of these API advancements will not actually occur until Drupal 8.5. For instance, the Drupal, this doesn't mean that core REST changes will be affected. Obviously, core REST will continue, but this does mean that JSON API, for instance, which has a current issue outstanding for inclusion into Drupal 8 core, will not actually materialize until Drupal 8.5. But I do want to clarify my point here that that is that this does not mean that progress on the core REST API stops whatsoever. So what are some of the improvements that we're working on for Drupal 8.5 and beyond? Well, a lot of the things that we've been working on in the API First initiative have been focused on addressing serialization gaps, some issues where the serialization process is revealing some things that we don't want it to reveal, or returning responses that are unwieldy or confusing to developers. But in terms of actual features that are relevant beyond just making sure that the foundation is stable of core REST, some of the things that the API First team is working on right now is around translation support, such that you can fetch an entity and get all of its translations in various languages, which is a very big point because we need to be able to access those multilingual benefits from a client-side application. Also, things like file uploads will be possible, so you'll be able to finally effectively upload files and download files, which is also possible right now if you do base64 encoding. But if you wanted to do something like, in terms of just a flat asset being pasted into the response. But if you wanted to do any sort of uploads of files, that's not currently possible in Drupal. And so these are some of the advancements that are happening in Drupal 8.5 that's going to be coming up ahead in the upcoming year. But I want to stop here and also say that, this is not where it ends. We've gotten to the point where we want to get some feedback from people who are using the REST API in core. And if you're not using custom resources, and if you're using the default resources that are available in Drupal core, what are some of the things that you need? What are some of the things that you would like to have supported in Drupal core? So finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the advancements that have been happening in the contributed ecosystem. Because as I mentioned before, core REST was a very big advancement, but oftentimes a lot of those features and a lot of those characteristics were not really suited for a lot of use cases that we've seen nowadays. So Relaxed Web Services, I have a later slide about this, but Relaxed Web Services is a module that is part of the Drupal deploy or Drupal workflow ecosystem. and it's a module that is providing an API serialization and is following the CouchDB API specification. For those of you who don't know what CouchDB is an Apache open source project which actually allows you to perform content synchronization across server to server. And this is very important because of workflow issues. The workflow module that's going to be entering Drupal core shortly, for instance, has capabilities that allow you to form workspaces. And in order for us to be able to transfer these workspaces to different environments, we need to have a way for these APIs to communicate with one another and transfer these things. And so relaxed web services is very important to workflow. And in order to note about one more note about CouchDB, CouchDB is very important for a wide variety of developers because PouchDB, for instance, is a client-side version of PouchDB, is a client-side equivalent of CouchDB, excuse me. And it allows you to have things like very particular use cases like offline-enabled applications where you have periodic content syncs with the server, and so on and so forth. So all of this is enabled through relaxed web services. And there's quite a few DrupalCon talks available about Relax if you're interested in learning more. What about JSON API? Well, JSON API is something that is very confusingly named because when we refer to JSON API, we're not actually referring to APIs that respond in JSON. They actually are, what I refer to them as is APIs in JSON. But the JSON API specification is totally different. JSON API is a specification for REST APIs that are in JSON, as I said before, that's very popular among JavaScript developers because it's a very, very easy standard and it's very quick to learn. And it's been adopted, for example, by the Ember JavaScript community as well as the Ruby on Rails communities to power their web services and their interactions with web services. JSON API provides a very standardized way to query single entities, so just by ID or a single node in Drupal. But what's really nice about JSON API is that rather than requiring you to fire off multiple requests to access embedded resources or to use REST exports if you want to get collections, JSON API will provide you relationships that are contained therein, as well as query operations via query string parameters. And as I said with collections, right now the only way to access resource collections, or to access entity collections within Drupal via these APIs is by using views REST exports or firing off multiple requests. And so JSON API actually allows you out of the box to get these collections very easily. So JSON API, as I mentioned before, is likely slated for incorporation into Drupal 8.5 core, but this is still prospective. And we're very close, of course, in terms of the module to entering beta for stability in Contrib. And so I know that that team is very urgently looking for testers, very urgently looking for people to contribute and experiment with this module. And there's the link to the module on your screen there. And if you're interested in learning more about the specification itself and the underlying foundation of JSON API, if you go to jasonapi.org, you'll see a lot of information about the standard that underlies this module. One note that I want to make about web services is that we also have to address the security of these web services. Currently, right now in Drupal 8, the only way to actually authenticate into Drupal's REST API is through basic auth. And basic auth, as you might have noticed from those Postman dummy requests that I pasted into these slides, you'll actually see that you're providing a username directly, but you're also providing a password that's really only that is not very well secured, right? Because what you really ideally want to be able to do is to get a session token out of Drupal that will allow you to perform requests and not have to provide your username and a lightly hashed password every single time. OAuth 2 is more secure for authenticating requests, and it's also very widely used and very common to see among REST APIs in the wider landscape. And if you're interested, that also is a module that is prospectively slated for Drupal 8.5. And if you want more information, there's the link to the currently in progress module on your screen there. Now, what about GraphQL? Well, GraphQL is actually not RESTful. It's a query language that enables fewer queries and limits response bloat. And what does that exactly mean? Well, rather than tightly coupling responses to a schema, which is what the REST API typically does in terms of any context, GraphQL actually overturns this practice, right? And so just to explain this a little bit further, what happens in the REST context is that you provide a request, and you issue a request that contains something that the server is able to interpret. But the fact of the matter is that you as the client have no control over what data comes back from the server. It's basically whatever the API decides is what is going to come back from that request, come back to that request, is what you get. GraphQL really overturns this paradigm because it allows for what's known as client-tailored client-tailored responses, which means that when the client requests a certain amount of data and only wants a particular amount of data, such as, let's say, I just only want the title of the node, and I only want the author of the node, but I don't want the body. GraphQL will actually return only the title of the node, the author of the node, and the body, because of the fact that the client is able to receive only what it needs, and the server is interpreting that request and actually mapping the response and writing the response dynamically such that the client has the appropriate response. So GraphQL, in this way, shifts responsibility from the server to the client. The server will publish what is possible in terms of a schema for the client to query, and the client will publish its requirements from the server instead of receiving a response that it has absolutely no control over that's been dictated by the server. So just to talk about this a little bit further and why this is so important, and I'll show you in just a couple of slides an illustration of how GraphQL actually looks from the standpoint of a client-side application developer. Well, typical REST APIs tend to be very static, as we know in Drupal. If you build a REST API and you upend the content model, you're going to have to update all of your applications on the client side or any decoupled applications that rely on Drupal in order to facilitate backwards compatibility. And this is true because you want to be able to have a stable content model and as stable of a content model as possible. But in Drupal's case, when you change the content model, when you add a new content type, when you change a content type, when you delete a content type in particular, that schema compatibility, that backwards compatibility where applications know what's coming back is no longer guaranteed. And so to prevent that process of having to rewrite all of your requests and all of your applications that you're using Drupal for, GraphQL actually allows you to have introspection into the type system that's available, the schema that's available. It allows you to introspect, to specify queries from the client. And so what this means is, in very simple words, what this means is that regardless of however your API changes, right, regardless of however your content model changes, the client is going to publish its requirements, and the server will respond with what's available. And so what's very important to realize here is that if you're relying on something from the client side, and you know that the content model has changed, GraphQL allows you to have much more visibility into how that API has changed and exactly what you need to do as an application developer to update your requests such that GraphQL, such that you can use those requests appropriately. So if you want more information about GraphQL, there's a very interesting webinar that we've done here at Acquia about this called GraphQL, Introduction to GraphQL, and I'd highly encourage you to check it out. And obviously there's the module on your screen there as well. So here's just a quick summary that's going to illustrate for you some of the differences between a lot of these things. So, for example, right now, if you want to query the core REST API for a particular article, let's say that the node of node ID 1 is an article, what you're going to get back is you're going to get a field author key with the value of, let's say, the user ID of that author. But you're not going to get any information about that author. You're not going to get any information about who that user is, their email, their password. Heaven forbid that you need that. But a lot of these things are not available in the Drupal core REST API. And so what you need to do is you actually need to fire two separate requests. You need to fire a GET to get the actual author's user ID from the node response. And you need to fire a new request to the user resource such that you can get the appropriate name of the user, for example, back. JSON API fixes this. And the way the JSON API fixes this is by allowing you to actually request via query string parameter a include, or something that is contained within that particular resource, within that particular entity. And so when I request an article and I know that I want to get that article response back, I also know that I want to get the author back as well and get some information about who that author is. In this case, his name is Joe. And I want to be able to get that in one single request because obviously you have issues of server latency and you have issues of performance on your application. So JSON API makes that possible. GraphQL makes it even easier from the standpoint of you as an application query, as a writer of those queries that you're firing from your application. In GraphQL, you specify that you want from your article, and this is merely illustrative, by the way. This is not necessarily, and this is no longer something that works within GraphQL. But if you wanted to request from GraphQL just the node with the title, and then also dig into those embedded resources within that resource, you actually can do that very easily in one response and actually get the exact same data structure that you wanted from the server in the client. And this is very, very good in terms of predictability, because if you want to write a query and you know exactly how that object is going to come back, that's very easy for the developer to interpret and parse that response appropriately. Well, I want to end here by zooming out a little bit to the big picture. I know that we've been digging very deep into these nitty-gritty details and talking about some of these very important nuances and characteristics of minor versions of Drupal and the future of Drupal and where things are headed. But I want to take a step back and think about this wider web services landscape that we find ourselves in. Drupal is not new to the API-first landscape, but it certainly is not the only player. And we have a lot of these competitors that are challenging the primacy of our REST API and our web services that are available in Drupal. The reason why is because we have backend as a service, content as a service, or headless CMS platforms, which are beginning to gain steam in the wild. You might have heard of these before if you've been building a lot of decoupled applications and you've been building a lot of JavaScript applications that are basically content applications that rely on some kind of CMS functionality. A lot of these examples are Contentful or Prismic or Built.io Content Stack or Cloud CMS or Kentico Cloud. And I want to take a step back here and think about some of the features that are available in these content as a service platforms. One thing that you might not know is that each of these platforms has an underlying back-end application that's similar to the Drupal editorial interface and administrative interface that allows you to perform basic CMS operations. So things like updating content or changing a user's information or recategorizing, retagging content. All of these things are possible. One of the things that I do want to note, however, and one of the things that you might not know, is that Contentful, for instance, in Cloud CMS, those applications that you use on the back end to administer the CMS are actually consuming and interacting with the exact same APIs that they encourage their developers to use when building their own applications. And so this brings up a very interesting question, which is, should Drupal be doing more to dog food our REST APIs? Should we, for instance, be rewriting our node edit forms and rewriting our user forms or rewriting a lot of these kinds of things that you do in the Drupal CMS to do the same thing? And would that accelerate progress within our web services landscape? I want to pose this question because as it stands right now, Drupal is very, very good at what it does in terms of a CMS. It's not so good at doing what it does in terms of exposing that functionality through an API. And one of the things that you might have noticed in my presentation so far is that we have a long ways to go before we can support those kinds of things. Configuration entities, for instance, have no ability to be updated or deleted or created. And this is very important if you want to do any sort of very deep administrative tasks within an application that is decoupled but Drupal-backed. By the same token, there's a lot of write capabilities that are unavailable and a lot of smaller features that are unavailable. If you want to be able to upload a file or access translations of a particular content entity, that's not really possible right now in Drupal. And so when we ask this question of content as a service, and we ask this question of what is Drupal's API-first future? What is the future of Drupal's web services from not the short-term aspect, but the long-term perspective? We have to consider for ourselves, what is the future that we really want for Drupal in terms of where it should go? If you're coming to DrupalCon Baltimore, I have a core conversation that's going to be upcoming about this called Decoupled from the Inside Out, together with Sally Young of Lullabot and Matt Grill of here at Acquia. And we're going to talk about what it's going to take for us to make Drupal a serious competitor and a serious leader in this landscape of content as a service. We're going to talk about what it will take for us to make all of these things possible via API, and possibly even to turn these things into services. So with that, I do want to also mention GraphQL. And the fact that, obviously the web services landscape is changing very rapidly. And one of the things that you might not know about GraphQL is that they're working very hard to integrate this thing with other systems and other platforms. And so in this landscape, we've got these two divergent things going on. We have content as a service platforms, which are reliant on REST APIs primarily and don't use a standard like JSON API, for instance. We also have GraphQL, which is an emerging specification for querying data. And so the question I pose to you now as the audience of this webinar and to end this presentation, of course, is what exactly is the future that we want for Drupal? Do we want it to be monolithic? Do we want it to be decoupled as a rule? And what are some of the ways, what are some of the steps that we're going to have to take to get there? Is it going to take dog fooding our user interfaces so that we match up to the dog fooding nature of Contentful, for example, and Cloud CMS? Is it a future where we adopt GraphQL as a rule and make sure that GraphQL is the way that we interact with all of our APIs from here on out? Is that important to our future, and is that something that will give us more adoption down the road? Some important questions to think about, especially in the context of whether the CMS as a whole should be decoupled, whether the CMS as a whole should be solely about web services and exposing that functionality through these APIs. With that, I'd like to thank you very much. And as I mentioned before, I am part of the Acquia Labs initiative here at Acquia, which is our innovation department. And if you're interested in learning more about some of these issues and how they fall into place when it comes to new content touchpoints and new devices and new ideas like conversational interfaces or IoT or set-top box applications or some of these very crazy approaches like beacon technology and machine learning, I'd love to talk to you. And here's some information for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Preston, for that very detailed, informative session that you led for us. And we're actually quite close to the end of the session, but still, if our audience have any questions, now is the time to type them in, and we will discuss them with Preston. But as you do that, I do have a couple of questions here with me that have come in. So first up, as you took us through the entire presentation, a lot of it was in a lot of technical details that you went into, that you mentioned. But the question is, the decoupled bit of Drupal or the web services that you mentioned, does it make things easier just for developers, or can you shed some light on the specific, let's say, business benefits that it might have, which would lead to Drupal becoming more popular with the enterprises?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the things that is very interesting about decoupled Drupal is that it is very much a trend that has been adopted and really disseminated by developers. The reason why is, and this really goes into the business benefits, the primary reason why developers are so interested in decoupling Drupal is because of an improved developer experience. If you want to use something like ES6 as a developer of JavaScript applications, or if you want to be able to write in a particular framework, oftentimes it's a lot easier to decouple the Drupal front end from the back end. Oftentimes, also, there's a business consideration involved, which is that in Drupal projects, what's very often happening is that you have a very strong need to have a cross-pollination and cross-interaction between developers who are working on the back end of Drupal, namely module development and some of the niceties of custom modules or plugins and so on and so forth, and the front-end developers at Drupal who are working on Twig, who are working with these front ends. And so one of the big challenges of Drupal projects is that you can't really pipeline development. And what I mean by pipeline development is you can't have the front-end team working in parallel with the back-end team on two separate things. Oftentimes what you find in these headless Drupal projects is that you have a front-end team that's working on a dummy API that's just a shared understanding of what the API is going to look like. And the back-end developers are working on building that API. But they're working in tandem on totally separate things. And they don't actually need to interact, and they don't actually need to be working as part of the same team. So as far as the business features go, and as far as some of the benefits of Drupal, it's a very developer-oriented thing if you want to decouple. And one of the reasons why people don't decouple is because you lose a lot of that functionality that's present in Drupal. You lose things like in-place editing, contextualized administration, layout management, user experience, accessible markup, system notifications and errors. All of these things fall to the wayside when you decouple Drupal, because when you're working with, let's say, editors who are going to be writing content on Drupal, they're never going to really have any access to changing how that looks in the eventual front end that's decoupled. That's up to the developers. And so it's a very a tough decision to decouple. And so the question I always ask, as I consult for people who are deciding whether or not it's a good idea to decouple is, who's more important? Is it the developers who are more important? Is it their requirements that far outweigh the requirements of the editors? Or is it the editors who really have the final say and need to have that sort of functionality in place? The other question I also ask, oftentimes is, where does the buck stop, right? Who ultimately is going to complain the loudest when this is released, and who ultimately is going to have the power to upend the way that this has been built? If you're interested in a lot of these issues, I highly recommend that you read a blog post that I wrote recently for Acquia called "The Risks and Rewards of Fully Decoupled Drupal," because that blog post really dives into what's in it for me as a business when I hear my developers saying that they want to decouple, but it might not be such a good idea for my editors and marketers.
All right. So you're saying going with decoupled Drupal actually becomes a choice that you make depending upon the kind of functionality and the kind of business goals that you're looking to achieve?
Exactly. And so I think this is very important when it comes to what kind of thing you're building, right? What is it that you're implementing? Because let's say, for example, that you're implementing a content, you're really interested in decoupling Drupal because of content syndication. You want to do the write once, publish everywhere dream that every content marketer loves to hear. You want to be able to publish that content to a native mobile app, to your Apple Watch, to your Samsung TV, to your Roku application, to websites, to whatever. That makes perfect sense. When it comes to decoupling Drupal, however, because you want to allow a better developer experience when it comes to websites and web applications, if you wanted to turn, for example, your .com into a decoupled Drupal web application or website, the considerations here become very important because what you're basically saying is that you're no longer going to use Drupal to render out the front end and serve the front end. And what that means is that everything that you've gotten used to in Drupal when it comes to interacting with your site on the front end, things like the toolbar, things like the little gear that shows up when you hover over a block, things like in-place editing, which allows you to click on any text and edit that right on the screen right then and there and see that take shape live. All those features get lost. And so the other really big issue here is frankly, if you're doing it for the purposes of a single website or a single web application, it's really not that good of an idea. And there are some other solutions that are possible, and there's some other ways of doing this that you can pursue. But fundamentally, I think that if you're a developer and you're really interested in what exactly is involved in developing, if your sole purpose is to speed up your own workflow, by all means decouple Drupal in the way that I've typed. But if you're really content, editors really benefit from preview. They really benefit from system messages, like when things have been published. They really benefit from a lot of feedback, and they really benefit also from that contextual, that in-context editorial experience where you can preview on the fly, live edit, do all sorts of those things, access tools from the front end. Decoupling Drupal for a website is not the best idea. I don't know if that was I hope that was a complete answer to that question.
That very much was, and I think that question led us into a completely different stream of thought altogether. But that was actually a very useful discussion to contemplate upon. So the next thing I have here is actually not exactly a question, but more of a clarification that one of our attendees is looking for. Is that you mentioned the API first initiative in a slide, and it is also referred to as WCS2. So is that so he was wanting to know if that's just an error or if it actually comes under WCS2.
Sure. So actually, the Web Services and Context Core initiative, which is also known as WSGI, ended when Drupal 8 was released because they reached their goal of providing rudimentary foundational web services in Drupal 8. And so that initiative has officially been sunsetted. There is no longer any active work being done that I know of on the goals of that initiative because the objective has been reached. The API First initiative is the successor to WSGI, meaning that we've picked up from where WSGI left off. We've decided that, yes, we now have web services available in core, but they could be a lot better and they could have a lot more power. And especially in the context of these other headless CMSs that are coming on the scene, these other APIs that are very compelling, we have to make sure to reach that kind of feature parity and make sure that Drupal is just as powerful with web services as those other platforms. And so, I would really say that WSGI and API First Initiative, they're both very much related and closely tied to each other. And there are people who worked on WSGI who are now working on API First. And basically, it's the same area of concern, which is web services. WSGI made web services happen in core, and the API First Initiative is making them better.
All right, so I think that's kind of all the time we've got today to take up questions. And as Preston said, if any of you have any more questions, you can definitely tweet out to him or send your questions to us at webinars@srijan.net, and we will try to get them answered by Preston. Also, I would like to say that the entire presentation and video recording will reach your inbox by sometime tomorrow. So with that, I think we come to the close of today's session. And Preston, thank you so much for taking the session with us and patiently answering all the questions that our audience had. It was a great session with you. And once again, thank you all our listeners for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.